Morgan, thanks for talking to me today. I just thought our conversation that we had before was so interesting on our single mothers by choice journey. And so, if you want to talk about your journey and how you made a decision to become SMBC, and then we'll get into the legal things that we don't. And I say things, I'm like using everyday vernacular. It's a try not to use like legal jargon, but you talk about the legalities, things that we may not think of.
Absolutely. So I made the decision to try to become a single parent by choice about 2 years ago. And it's been quite a journey. I'm still on it right now. So I first decided and started to look into, of course, the biggest problem for a solo woman usually trying to become pregnant is to find sperm. And so I started off, looking at anonymous or like open ID at 18 kind of donor options, and found out just how expensive a vial of sperm can actually be. And so I went that way initially, tried with an IUI through a midwife, and then made the ultimate decision, what I thought at the time was the ultimate decision, to abandon the idea of an anonymous donor and instead go with a known donor. And so then I started the search to find somebody who could be known to my child from birth. And in that process, talked with lots of different people, found a potential donor. And of course, at that point was starting to look into how do you make it so that that person would not have parental legal rights and responsibilities to the child, and that it truly would be a donor. And what I found was that there's kind of an entire almost underground network of people that are just finding donors online and connecting, not talking to an attorney, not making sure to dot I's and T's, and just, simple exchange of sperm in a bathroom or something like that. And it's just putting people at tremendous risk, on both sides. If you have a parent, and you want to make sure that you are the sole parent and you've got sole decision-making responsibilities and obligations to the child, you don't want to have to be accountable to somebody else for that. So of course it's a big risk for the parent, but then it's a big risk to the donor as well. It affects everything, not only child support, which is of course what we would normally think of, but it affects inheritance. It affects all sorts of other things that kind of go even beyond this lifetime. So those are kind of some of the things that I started to realize, that were issues. And so I started to look into what could I as an attorney do to try to solve those for people, so that if somebody wants to use a known donor, they can do that, but they can also do that in a way that's safe, both physically safe and also safe legally. So
that is so interesting. I mean, I didn't even think of that. When I think of the legal aspect of it, I just think of rights and accountability and who's responsible and, sharing the holidays, but oh my God, inheritance and all of that. I didn't even think of that. It's so interesting. I remember when I got very open about my journey, and well before, we were talking to some friends, and there was a guy friend who offered to be my sperm donor. Basically, it was we could co-parent or whatever. And then, he talked about you could take the baby for Thanksgiving and I think for Christmas. And I was like, yeah, no. And so it had me thinking about the legalities and what other options there are for people. So that is so interesting because, my journey was IVF, use a sperm donor from a sperm bank, because I didn't want to deal with those legalities. And thank God, because there's so much to learn. So I figured the sperm bank had the contracts and all that stuff, and my child's protected. Obviously, it says, I remember skimming through it, obviously, to understand, okay, yeah, obviously, I'm not going to go to donor for child support, I'm solely responsible for the child and this and that. But understanding that becoming a single mother by choice, there's so many different ways in which you can do it. It's not just IVF or you use sperm from a sperm bank. There's, using donor sperm, using donor eggs, donor embryos. There's everything. There's adoption. There's using a known donor, unknown donor. There's so many things. So yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. So I think one other kind of thing to think about, you're talking about, maybe sometimes the more traditional path or the more common path is to choose a donor from a bank. And one thing to kind of realize is that not all banks are created equal. So every bank is going to have their own different set of individual policies and procedures and contracts that they require you to sign and stuff like that. And that includes provisions related to family limits. So you want to make sure that there's not going to be too many children or too many families that are going to all be sharing the same donor. And sometimes that can actually run up against people's opinions about what they want to do if they have embryos left after they're done with their treatments and they're not desiring to have any more children. If in a traditional couple where going through IVF, where each person is contributing their own gametes, then they've got control over if they want to choose to donate that embryo to somebody else, then that is kind of a decision that they can individually make because they can each consent right then and there. It complicates things when you're using donor sperm, and especially donor sperm where you don't have the other person's contact information, because you can't obtain that consent necessarily to donate further. And then sometimes you can, or sometimes it can also run up against the sperm bank's policies related to family limits, because the bank can only track what they sell directly, but then when that's donated further, how does that affect reporting back to the banks? And then how does that ultimately affect how the children that could result from a future donation, either of remaining sperm or of remaining embryos through embryo donation, how does that affect their ability to get the donor's contact information when they turn 18? Like it would for the children that were conceived whose parents bought directly from the bank. So there's all sorts of things, even within that, of making sure to read and really understand what the contract is that the bank has with you, making sure that you understand what you're allowed to do in terms of your embryo disposition, and if that aligns with your personal, objectives and beliefs about whether or not you want to donate remaining embryos.
Oh, that's a good point, because I had some embryos left. I mean, I'm definitely going for a second child later in life, maybe a couple of years or so. But then I'll have embryos on top of that. And I never actually considered, right? Like, do I even have, I have to go back and read my contract. Like, do I have authority to donate those embryos, or what I can do with them? Oh my God, it's so interesting. Let me make a note of what I got to do.
And it's a hard thing, because maybe you feel, or I don't want to say what you feel, but a lot of people feel very connected and like they don't want to like not give the embryos a chance. Exactly. But at the same time, it's also really important that people can trust, if they signed up with a bank that has a 25 family limit, you want to make sure that the bank can trust that as much as possible. And if the bank assumes that only the people that are purchasing the sperm are the ones that are actually using it, well, then they're going to sell up to what they think is 25 families. And in reality, it might be more than that, because just the nature of the timeline, you never really know until it's kind of too late. And then if every single family donates to one other family, well, then you've just doubled it and gone from 25 to 50. And that's a big jump, of course. So that's also why it's so important to report back to the banks when you do have a pregnancy or a live birth, so that they are able to better track and try to keep that number under control.
Right. So let me ask you this. So, because I know the sperm bank I use, they ask that we report back. Now, obviously, if I forgot or whatever, then there's nothing they can do about it. But I knew there had to be a reason to report back. So I made sure to report back that I had a pregnancy and the second part of actually delivering, right? Like, so the baby's here. So the sperm bank actually kind of educates you on that, helps you with that. But what are the pros and cons of using and I keep saying sperm bank, but obviously you can do egg donor as well. So of using a donor bank versus doing things on your own, like what are the pros and cons or things to, I guess, keep in mind depending on which route you decide to use?
It's a very personal question. And I think one of the things to really think about is, what do you want your children to be able to find out or know about their donor, and at what point in their life? I have heard, and I'm involved in a community of donor conceived people, because I think as a professional in this space, it's really important for me to center the people that are going to be coming out of the contracts that I'm writing and stuff like that. And so in talking with donor conceived people, I've seen quite a bit of advocating for using known donors for all sorts of reasons, so that people can better understand kind of that fundamental question of where they came from and what their family, and I'm using family in the genetic sense rather than the legal sense, but
Okay.
basically like where their genetic roots are. And I think that can actually be achieved in two ways, both through a known connection, because then of course, if they have a question, they can just ask it. And I think there's a value there. And I think a lot of people do see a value there to be able to have that kind of like open relationship from birth. There's also advantages to being able to be connected in the ability to receive family medical history. A lot of times donors are young when they're donating. They're in their early 20s, maybe they're college students, maybe they didn't actually go to their mom or dad or their grandpa or their aunts and uncles and actually dig into what all of their family medical history is. And so although all the sperm banks provide self-reported medical history, that may or may not be accurate for individual donors. So I think there's a benefit to known donation to be able to have an ongoing communication where if something comes up or if a donor learns of something, you've got maybe a little bit more assurance that that's actually going to be information that's passed on to you. That being said, there's a lot of risks to known donation. Of course, there's legal risks because there's, of course, the chance that a donor could come in and try to get parental rights over a child, which is probably the one that people are the most scared of. There's a chance that you don't know the donor as well as you think you do, especially with people that are doing like informal kind of connecting through Facebook groups and stuff like that. Then there could be donors that are in there for completely the wrong reasons, and you don't want to get caught up in that. So I think certainly lots of risks to known donation as well. There's also a little bit of a longer timeline if you choose a known donor. Typically what that would entail when you're working with a fertility clinic is that the donor would need to come in and provide the samples, but then they also need to do all of the health testing, STI testing and stuff like that. Yeah. And then there's actually a FDA, I don't believe it's a requirement, I believe it's a recommendation, but almost all reputable fertility clinics that I'm aware of stick to this, which is that the sperm is actually quarantined for 6 months before you're able to use it. So especially if you are an older person or somebody with eggs that are maybe a little bit older, you might not have 6 months that you want to pause your fertility treatment basically in order to allow that period to lapse. So that can be another reason why somebody, even if they have a known donor that they would really like to use, might choose to go the sperm bank route, is that it's a little bit easier. It's the quarantine period is already passed. You can kind of just like online shopping, click buy and it's sent. Yeah. And so it just makes the process a little bit faster and a little bit smoother. And then, like you said as well, finally, the contracting stuff. When you use a bank, the donor has already given up all of the legal parental rights and responsibilities when they made the donation to the bank. So that those contracts are pretty well buttoned up. When you're talking about a known donor situation, it gets a lot more murky, and it's also state by state. So just because something is true in California does not mean it's true in Texas or in Illinois or in New Jersey. So you just have to be more careful and more mindful, which usually means that you are personally going to be hiring an attorney to represent you in drafting a contract. And then typically the intended parent will also pay for the attorney for the donor. So those two attorneys can make sure to be in concert and create a contract, which is as solid as possible to protect everybody involved if you go the no donor route. So of course that adds costs. Maybe that adds $2,500 or $3,000 between both attorneys. And depending on how you're trying to conceive, if you're doing IUIs and you're going to be purchasing lots of vials of sperm, that might be the cheaper option. But if you're doing IVF and you just need one vial, then maybe it's not the cheaper option. So
I feel like this is where I should pause and remind everybody, like, this is not legal advice, right? We're just like chatting and discussing the concepts and things that you should be aware of. And so this is not legal advice, but I'm like listening to this, I'm just like, I think we all should just use a sperm bank or make sure you have an attorney. Like I said, I've had a few of my male friends, just guys who think like they're God's gift to women, right? Like, oh, you're trying to have a baby on your own. I can help. Let me be kept and save a hoe or whatever. I'm not calling myself a hoe. I think I don't know where I just came from, but basically, like, let me be your hero and your savior, and here, have my sperm. And it's like,
yes,
for me, I was like, oh my God, I did not want to think about like the legal aspect of it. I don't want any of this to like come back and bite me, and I just want 100% rights and be responsible for my child and do whatever I can. And whoa, like I just think if I ever did, you know, my friends or guys that I know, it's like, oh my God, like all these things you don't consider because you go in thinking, you know, you're looking through rose-colored glasses, right? Or you're just like, oh, no, I think I could go wrong. This is so beautiful. Okay, yeah, you agree to give me your sperm, and like, sayonara, that's it, the end of it. And you don't think of everything that could go wrong. Like, if somebody, you know, like your kid becomes like some kind of prodigy, and all of a sudden they're like, hey, I want to be part of this child's life, right?
I mean, yeah, that's true. There's also a lot that could go right, though. I think there's like an upswing to it too. So I don't want to say that one is better than the other. It's really a personal decision. And one of the things, you know, that I do kind of think is interesting is hearing from more and more donor conceived people that do really value the ability to find out information about their donor. And for some people that will outweigh it. There's also some situations where you can maintain maybe a family connection. And maybe this is less relevant just for the single parent by choice community, but I help a lot of LGBT people in the community as well that are using donor conception. And in a lot of those situations, you might be able to maintain like a biological connection to both sides of their family by using, say, a brother or a sister of one of their partners. And that can help them to be able to have like the same genetic grandparents on both sides of the family and stuff like that. So that's another area where I see potentially like the benefit of a known donor outweighing all of these like hoops that you might have to jump through to make it possible.
That reminds me of an episode of Modern Family. I don't know if you ever watched that show.
A little, not
okay. So there is a same-sex couple, Mitch and Cam, and there was an episode where Mitch asked his sister to be an egg donor. And then Cam asked his sister to be something like that, where they can all have the same, you know, the kids can have the same genetic makeup within their family. They end up not doing it, but it was an interesting episode. So anyways, a shout to Modern Family, because I love that show. I can watch it over and over. But, you know, so one of the things you were talking about, how different things to keep in mind, whether you're using, you know, an egg donor, sperm donor, embryo donation, surrogate. So what are some of the biggest differences or things that you should keep in mind for, I guess, each route or each option?
I guess, of course, the piece that you're missing is what you'll have to go with. So if you're missing the sperm, then you're going down the route of the sperm donation. The industries are a little bit different. I will say sperm donation is probably the most like straightforward. They just donate to a bank. There's typically a catalog. You typically just pick your donor, sign whatever the bank forms are, and have it shipped out. And it's pretty straightforward. Egg banks, it gets a little bit more complicated, or I should say maybe egg donation as opposed to egg banks, because there's a few different ways that you can do it. There are some banks that are similar to the sperm banks where you just go and the eggs are previously retrieved. They're already cryopreserved. The donor's picked out of a catalog in a similar way, and they are ready to ship. Of course, much more expensive than donor sperm to get donor eggs, but that's an option. Another option is what would be more like a fresh cycle. So where you choose your donor and then your donor is undergoing essentially the first half of IVF, the egg retrieval process. And then that can actually sometimes be synced up if you are the recipient with your own cycle so that you can go straight into a transfer right after the eggs are retrieved. So that would be kind of like the ability to do more of a fresh cycle with the donor that you select at that point. There are also sometimes programs through fertility clinics that will maybe share an egg donor between recipient families. There might be like 2 or 3 families that share the eggs from an egg donation cycle. So that's an option. There's another program. I was actually an egg donor in my long process towards this point.
Wow.
So I told you that I tried a few IUIs, which were not successful, and then tried with this known donor for a little bit that was not successful. And then I started looking into, well, how do I switch to IVF? And one of the big barriers there is cost. IVF can be extremely expensive. Course. And so I found a program that basically allows you to undergo a round of IVF where the eggs are shared between the intended family and yourself. So I was able to keep a portion of the eggs, and then a portion of the eggs were donated to the intended parents that I did a retrieval for. So that would be another option, is if you wanted to go that route, you could do that. And it's similar in the sense of you're matching with an agency. They help you to identify somebody that would be a good fit for you, that fits the criteria you want in terms of education and looks and all sorts of stuff. But once you find that person, it's kind of like anything else, but you would be getting a portion of the eggs from their cycle, and then they would be and I guess the other piece to think about is compensation. Donors are typically compensated, and the compensation can often be pretty significant, into several $1,000s. So that can become a barrier for people. Then I guess shifting into the idea of embryo donation. Embryo donation is probably one of the more affordable ways to start a family, because typically you're using embryos that have already been created when somebody else has gone through the IVF process. And so you can receive those embryos. You're typically not compensating the original family for, you can't like purchase the embryo. And so you're typically receiving it at no cost, other than the fact that you're paying for their attorney's fees and your own attorney's fees to facilitate the transfer of that. So that can be one of the more cost-effective ways. If you can't, say you need an egg donor and you were going to use a sperm donor anyway, at that point, a lot of people might make the decision just to choose an embryo donation as opposed to trying to do both an egg donor and a sperm donor.
And then how about using a surrogate or maybe even adoption? And if this is like way out of your realm, like we can edit this whole question out. I'm just
absolutely. Yeah. So in terms of using a surrogate, the complexities just go up. When we're talking about surrogacy, in terms of price range, to be transparent, we're likely going to be talking about at least $100,000, if not up to maybe $160,000, $200,000 all in. So it's a very expensive process. But the process of surrogacy is, in essence, very similar to the process of going through IVF up until the surrogacy journey really begins. So you are still needing to create embryos. So if you were going to use an egg donor, then you're finding and identifying your egg donor. They're going through their egg donor cycle to create your embryos, or you're going through the egg retrieval process yourself to get the eggs to create the embryos. Or maybe you're receiving them through embryo donation, but somehow you're getting the embryos. And the embryos are not going to typically be using gametes from your surrogate. So that's a common misconception, is that the surrogate is the biological mother of the child. And that's typically not the case in almost every state, and probably 99% of surrogacy journeys, maybe more than that. It's a gestational surrogate only. So they are transferring an embryo that is unrelated to the surrogate. The surrogate is undergoing all of her own testing to make sure that she's a good candidate for that. There's contract negotiation, just like you would do with an egg donor, except it's a little bit more in depth, because you're going into, all sorts of complications that could arise from somebody carrying a pregnancy, all the way through the birth, which is a bit more elaborate. So there's additional things to think about in terms of health insurance for the baby, pregnancy expenses, medical expenses, psychological consults, all sorts of stuff like that along the way. So if you're going that route, you're typically going to be hiring an agency, and the agency will typically be helping with matching you with a surrogate, and they'll walk you through kind of each step as it comes along. I would probably recommend most people are working with an agency if they need to use a surrogate. It's technically possible to do it as an independent journey, just, find someone that and try to make it work. But you're going to still have to jump through all those hoops. You don't want to skimp out on thinking, we'll skip legal or we'll skip the psych consult. Like, these are things you want to make sure these are all buttoned up so that your child is protected.
Yeah. Because I feel like, for the most part, us women who decide to become single mothers by choice, part of that choice or the reasoning behind it is like, we want peace of mind, right? Where we're just like, okay, we don't want to have to deal with somebody, or a partner, or have to wait, or whatever the case may be. But I think there is an element of like, okay, I want to do this on my own, have peace with my child and stuff. I feel like if you're not careful with the legal part, you can, kind of cancel out all that peace that you were seeking, right? If you don't.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Dot your I's, cross your T's. So this is so interesting. So can I ask you like a personal question? Again, this is like coffee shop talk. So like for you, like knowing the legal part of it, and then like you talk so well about the science part of it. And I know you're not a mom yet, but do you compartmentalize like, okay, the legal side and like being a mom, and that, what I mean? Like, I'm just like, I'm like, oh,
I feel like I
forget all that.
I've just been learning so much, and it's so interesting because like my job now, and I guess the area that I found passion within the law is from this experience that I've had, and had I not made the decision to become a single parent by choice, I would not have opened Pineapple Law. This was not something that was on my radar. If you asked me 2.5 years ago, I had probably absolutely never even thought of sperm donation. It didn't, I don't know. I'm queer, but I was rather late into coming out. And I kind of always thought, that I had to just marry a man or something so that I could, have a child. And I was just, if we're talking, I'm open about my story, but I was engaged to a man and I called off that engagement and made the decision to become a single parent by choice. Shortly after that, basically, as soon as I realized that it was an option, I was like, that became the new plan A.
Right.
I didn't want to have to try to rush into another relationship. I didn't want to have to put the pressure on that relationship. I didn't want to have to share decision making, or anything like that. To me, parentage no longer became tied to a relationship. Parentage became its own compartment in my life. And that's not to say that I don't eventually want to date or even get married or even, have a relationship, regardless of who that's with. But to me, they're no longer linked together anymore. I can be a parent and not be a partner, or I can be a partner and not be a parent, or I can be both. But my partner does not necessarily have to be a parent either. And so I like that flexibility that I have.
How empowering. I'm so happy for you. That's so empowering. Oh, I love it. I love it. There you go. Taking away that linkage between having to be married and having a child. You can do, and I think I shared it with you before as well. It's just because I decided to be a single mom by choice doesn't mean that I don't see myself getting married or having a partner later in life. But first of all, there's no longer that linkage, and it no longer has to be in that order. It doesn't have to be, you know what I mean? Like I said, my family starts with my daughter, and then it can grow into having a husband or a long-term partner, whatever you call them, whatever, if I decide to get married, I don't know. And I love that. I think that's a really good bit. I love the way that you said, and I love that you were empowered to make that decision. And it's similar to me. It's I realized that was an option. For me, it was freezing my eggs first, and then still giving myself time to meet Mr. Right, and then realizing, okay, well, that clock, and I don't want to say biological clock, but more of just that window in which I'd want to have, you know what I mean? When I'm so vibrant and I can still run and chase my baby, stuff like that. Again, I froze my eggs for that reason, to give me more time, but still just to be a certain point in my life. And so for me, it was okay, well, I was able to freeze my eggs, and, I kind of tapped into that world, that IVF and all that stuff. So it's oh, well, all I need is sperm, or donors for that. So it was really empowering. I think we touched on everything. Is there anything else that you want to talk about? I can feel it's kind of, like I said,
you asked me about adoption. Do you want me to?
Yeah. Let's do that, because, I think it's really important to know that, again, I talk about my journey about using IVF, and because for me, it was important. I wanted to carry a child, but I know people who are just I had a friend of mine in her early 20s. She always wanted to adopt before she had a biological child. So there are people like that. So knowing that that's also an option to be a single mom by choice is adoption. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah. So, okay. So a little bit about the adoption option, a wonderful way to build a family. So there's different paths in adoption. And the two main ones are going through an adoption agency to try to adopt a child, like a baby, a newborn. And that typically involves matching with someone who's pregnant with the pregnancy that they feel that they would be unable to keep and care for the child, and they want to find, a home for their child. In a lot of ways, that's kind of, almost similar to a surrogacy kind of match. Of course, the person's not going to be carrying the pregnancy intentionally, but you're matching with a family that's going to fit yours. You're typically putting together a profile of yourself and your family and what you want that to look like, the home that you could give the child. There's usually ongoing communication with the parent throughout. You're also going to have attorneys on both sides working on making sure that the legalities are all taken care of. So that's definitely one option for building a family with adoption. The other option is typically a foster care to adoption route. So this is typically families where the child or children were removed from the home because of situations involving abuse and neglect. And so, of course, these are really challenging situations. Oftentimes there's a lot of trauma that's involved for the children. And also the goal is different. The goal in foster care is to get the families to the point where there is able to be family reunification, and the child can either be placed back with whoever their original caretakers were once those people have been able to get back on track or get a little bit more stability or whatever it was that caused the issue in the first place. The goal to be able to kind of rehabilitate and get back to the position where the parents can rejoin with the children. If you go the foster care route, you probably have a heart of gold, but there can be a lot of loss associated with that as well, because you have to open your doors to a family and to children where you don't know whether or not they're going to be ultimately staying with you or returning to the care of their parents, or, you know, potentially returning to the care of other people in their family, whether it's a grandparent or something else like that, just to try to keep the children as close as possible with their families. It's hard, but it is a way that some people do choose to become single parents by choice, is that they will foster, and maybe it happens on the first child, or maybe you have a handful or even a dozen or more kids coming through your house, and you're making the choice to parent those children for as long as you have the blessing to be able to do that. And if that is forever, and if the child, you know, becomes adoptable, then maybe that's a route that you can go, but not something that you count on. So those are the two kind of ways that you would pursue adoption if you wanted to become a sole.
You know, I remember, and I don't know if it was like a movie or a show or real life, I don't remember, but where it was difficult for a single parent to adopt a child. Because again, society puts this pressure or like this expectation of having a mother and a father, you know, two-parent home. And, you know, like a single person, whether it was a man or a woman, you know, it was difficult for them. Would you say that that's not the case anymore? You know, like, is it easier for single people to adopt?
I would say that it is generally going to be possible. In the situation where you're adopting through an agency, ultimately it's the choice of the birth mother. So you might take longer to match because, you know, maybe birth mothers would prefer, you know, a two-parent household. But I don't think that that's always the case. There very well could be, you know, people that think that a single parent by choice is perfectly capable of providing a raising home for a child. So
parent that's giving up their child can dictate who adopts a child. So they're like,
usually,
I don't want to have the child, take care of this child, but I'm going to stipulate how this. That's interesting.
Yeah, they usually are. So you would be putting together like a profile of yourself and what your family would be in pictures and stuff like that. And then the parents that are birthing the child would be looking through that in order to try to see who they think would be the best fit for raising their child.
Okay.
And then these are also, it's definitely changed. You know, and to be totally transparent, I don't do a lot of adoption work. I did one adoption this summer, and it actually was to a solo parent by you know, who was adopting, which was amazing, but in kind of within the family. So it was a situation within her family that the child came to her, and that's another way that it could come up, is just somebody that you know in real life, you know, is having a child that wants you to be the one to care for them.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, no judgment. I don't know what's the right, if I'm not the person is to judge whether something's right or wrong, but it's just interesting to me that someone who's giving up parental rights can dictate that, well, I don't want a single parent. I want, you know what I mean? Like what kind of family they go into is like, that's interesting. Okay. But I mean, it is what it is. I'm sure there's a reason behind it. There's
a lot more openness now. A lot of times birth parents are remaining in contact with their birth children throughout childhood. So in many cases, it might be somebody that's nearby, you know, or at least that this person feels like it's someone that they could have an ongoing relationship with so that they can stay involved in the child's life. It used to be very much more just like adopt the child and then you try to forget about it or something like that. And I think that that's becoming much less the norm. There's actually, I think, a lot of overlap in the way that adoption is informing maybe trends within donor conception. So within donor conception, we used to have this idea about anonymity and just thinking, you know, well, it's just donor gametes, doesn't really matter. How the child's raised is what matters most. And so we'll just donate or just give away the sperm or sell the sperm and never think about it again. And you've seen now more and more banks are going away from totally anonymous donation and into ID release at 18, where the child is provided at least that like identifying information about their donor once they turn 18. And I think that there's probably in the future just a prediction that it's going to become even more and more open like that than that is now. And we're seeing that with egg donation. So for example, the egg donor cycle that I did through Fertility, which is the agency that was the shared cycle, that was a situation in which the recipient parents and I matched on paper. And then we actually had a conversation. We had a Zoom call to meet each other. And I got to know a little bit about them. They got to know a little bit about me and decide it was a good match. You know, I flew out for the retrieval that we did, and we went out to dinner. You know what I mean? And so that's, and the idea, you know, if it was successful, the idea was that, you know, my children would be able to grow up knowing their children as biological half siblings. And the idea about like sibling relationships as well. And so I think that that's part of where it's getting there in the egg donor space, but it's not at the same point on the sperm donor space, which to me is really interesting because fundamentally they're not that much different. A half sibling is a half sibling, whether it's a half sibling by egg donation or half sibling by sperm donation. And so I kind of think that I see an opportunity, and I think that there's probably going to be trends toward more and more openness, and maybe we will see some banks or something like that making the decision to become more open with sperm donation as well.
I mean, it's like inevitable, right? With like 23andMe and me and all those DNAs, like, you know, even if you, because I chose the known ID, right? Where my daughter turns 18, if she chooses, she can, you know, reach out to him and get to know him, the donor. But, you know, even if that donor was like unknown, I hear those stories, right? Like I know of a family actually who used donor sperm, and it was supposed to be like an unknown donor, I guess, where obviously they knew about him, but can't really interact with him. But they found him on Facebook. You know, like they did the 23andMe, then find out like a cousin who, whatever, and then, you know, they knew the person like went on Facebook, saw pictures of him, was like, oh my God, looks just like my, you know, my child. It's a kind of like inevitable, you know, like the idea of,
I think so, yeah,
giving, you know, donating anonymously is probably like a false, you know, expectation, I guess.
Yes, I think that's true.
So
keeping it manageable, that's another reason why the family limit is so important, because if all these children are turning 18, you know, can you imagine being a donor and then suddenly having what you thought would be maybe a max of like 10 or 12 or even 20 kids. And then you find out like, oh, well, it was actually like 25 families. So maybe there's like 60 kids. And it's like, well, if each of them want even a limited relationship, that is a lot, you know, to take on. And maybe it's something that maybe they didn't talk about it when the donor eventually got married or something like that. Maybe they've got their own family. There's all sorts of like complicated relationships there as well. So I think that's another thing to think about, is just like how do we set expectations, even for our kids, about like, well, you can know the identity of the donor, but we don't know what their response is going to be. We don't know if the response is going to be welcoming or not. And setting that like expectations so that, I don't know. I think we kind of have to take some responsibility for like, we're making this decision, and in many ways it's a wonderful decision. And there's some ways in which it could be a decision that could sting for a child down the road. And for me, at least, that's something that I'm trying to be thoughtful of and mindful about, is trying to do as much as I can for my future kid to absorb that, and set expectations so that, you know, so there's less disappointment, at least. To the extent I can control it. And some of it is just out.
And for me, it was just about giving her an option. You know, my prayer is that she grows up in a way where she's confident, doesn't feel the need to, you know what I mean? Like, doesn't feel like she's missing anything. But again, I just don't want to take that option away from her. You know, if she wants to, and I'm glad that he would be okay with that. But you know, it reminds me of the. I know you're probably gonna think like, this girl spends way too much time in front of the TV, but it reminds me of Family Guy, and I also hope you're not judging my taste in this show. But I know there's an episode where the father Peter, like, it became known like I guess his sperm was used, or he donated sperm, and and like, like hundreds of kids just showed up and were like, yeah, you're my dad. And it's like, there's like all these variations of him, like, black, white, girl, boy, it was a funny episode. But you said like from the donor perspective, how overwhelming it might be to like get all these kids.
I can't even imagine. Yeah. And you want to be welcoming. You said you would, right? Like when you went through the process, you said like, oh, I hope somebody reaches out to me. But like, did you really think about what that meant? And that's why I really hope that, when you're for anybody that might be listening that hasn't chosen their donor yet, when you're looking at comparing the different banks, that's why one of the things I would recommend that you look at and ask questions about is what do they provide their donors in terms of psychological counseling in advance, so that they've had the chance to know that the donors have thought about this and understand that when they're saying yes to contact, they're not saying yes, to contact maybe once with one child. They're saying yes to a commitment that they're reasonably confident that they can actually uphold. That commitment. And so just something to think about as you're comparing banks.
Ooh, I'm going to reach out to my bank and ask. I'm wondering, it was so long ago. It was like I chose my sperm donor like 2.5 years ago. So I'm going to go back and look at my contract, see what it says. Because I do remember there was like a mental health analysis, and I'm going to look to see if they had any mention of like a consultation. Because I know, like, I don't know for you, but my fertility clinic required I do like counseling at the onset of my journey, just to make sure I understood what it meant, and that like my fears and stuff were addressed, and even how to communicate to my child and share her story, how she came to be. So that's interesting. If the donor went through something similar, interesting.
And we can't control things that are already in the past. So I don't want you to like,
Oh yeah, no, I'm not going to hang up on getting arrested. Right? It's like a past already. So I'm not going to go back.
Before you had information. But for those that might be listening to this conversation that haven't selected a bank yet or haven't selected a donor yet, these are questions that you can start to think about. Yeah. And I think also the more that we ask the banks these questions, the more that they realize how important it is to have thought about these things. And we're ultimately the consumers pushing an industry in one way or the other. And I think it's imperative on us to push the industry in a way, that is as ethical as possible for our children that will result from this. Yeah.
If anything we didn't address, then people could comment or reach out to you and stuff like that. So, Morgan, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the invitation to talk with you. I did. It was great. So, and people are certainly welcome to reach out to me. I'm happy to have one-on-one conversations with anybody. So if something struck, something that you're interested in learning more about, or that you want to talk about, or if you've got a known donor situation, you need a contract or something like that, please feel free to reach out to me. I can either help you or I can point you in the right direction. So
Awesome. Thank you, Morgan.